I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing the world in 2020 and the world we face in 2021. 2020, that was the year that was. It will literally never be forgotten. Huge numbers, millions of people were either cut down and killed by a pandemic, or were debilitated in one way or another by that pandemic, or died because the health services of various countries had to be switched or were switched almost in their entirety to dealing with a virus. So people have died of things they might otherwise have been able to be treated for and survived. War, of course, has continued to rage. In Yemen, in particular, the death toll and the toll of disease and even famine has continued almost unreported in the Western media. It was the year when Donald Trump finally came to an end, although I'm not sure that we've seen the last of him yet. He is Time Magazine's Man of the Year, Mr. Joe Biden. I'm not sure he'll be the man of next year. Kamala Harris definitely standing behind him with a will and a way to power. It's been the year in which Britain finally left the European Union. It was the year in which the final defeat, almost final defeat, of the great conspiracy against Syria was finally confirmed. The conspiracy, which involved the former colonial powers, the American empire, their Gulf satrapies, billions and maybe hundreds of billions of dollars in propaganda and in war materiel, in mercenaries, were all poured into Syria to try and destroy the Syrian Arab Republic, a secular Arab republic. Peculiar, isn't it? All these secular Western countries assisting the head-chopping, throat-cutting, heart-eating maniacs of Islamist fanaticism in the form of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It was the year of terrible destruction in Lebanon, where finally the finger of blame at the correct officials has begun to happen. That after much of the year, fake news and fake allegations about others somehow bizarrely being to blame. It's a year in which the Western economies, and indeed the economies in most of the world, though not all of it, have gone into free fall, portend a collapse in many Western countries in 2021, perhaps. It's the year in which China's rise continued, bouncing back from the coronavirus to be the only economy in the world that's actually growing, and growing fast. 2021 is likely to be a new Chinese year. Much to discuss with my audience of distinguished experts, so let's kick off straight away. Dr. Tom Piers, a psychiatrist and a political activist, I would have thought you were perfectly placed to point us through the thicket of the news of 2020. After all, there was quite a lot of psychiatric behavior on view. Donald Trump seemed at times to be on the brink of madness. Joe Biden, his nemesis, probably didn't know he was there most of the time. Was this the year of psychiatric politicians?
Well, unfortunately so, but I think, I must say, I think to become a top-level politician, you've got to have something wrong with you to get that high up, to be a leader of a, say, leader of America or Britain. I think with the issue with Trump and Biden, we've got an issue of one Russophrenic versus a narcissist. I mean, sure, Trump's gone out of the way, but the only worry, my worry is with Biden coming in, he's going to want to renew his campaign against Russia. we're going to hear Russia in news again. Whereas Trump was more anti-China, I think Biden's going to be more anti-Russia. In terms of
or both, of
or
course.
both, indeed.
The New York Times op-ed, no, the Washington Post op-ed towards the end of the year was warning Biden not only to concentrate on confronting China, but alleging that Russia is involved in a secret war against the United States, and that thus he must fight a war on two fronts against China and Russia. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, I can see us having another Steele dossier Mark II coming up. More fake news against Russia, more claims that Russia's paying off the Taliban to kill American troops. I mean, all these claims have been debunked, of course, but people do fall for them, unfortunately. The media's aggressively pushing them, and I think we'll see more of the same next year.
Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos about to publish a wonderful book on the new Russia foreign policy. Many people will be looking forward to that around the world. You're political analyst, of course, and editor of Politics First magazine. First of all, give us your summary of 2020, and perhaps more importantly, your predictions for 2021.
Well, there's no question about it that 2020 has been a truly abhorrent year. But I think we need to acknowledge that Iraqis, Syrians, Libyans and Serbs would say that their experiences over the last 25 years or so have been far worse in comparison to what most of the world has experienced this year. It was only a few years ago that the Syrian people, in my estimation, were on the brink of annihilation at the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Now, I think when we talk about the devastating impact that what is known as COVID-19 has had on the world, we have to determine which part of the world we're talking about, because most countries in the world took precautions against COVID-19. However, in Russia, Iran, Syria or Cuba, we didn't hear talk from politicians there or journalists there about a new normal. We haven't heard politicians or journalists in the aforementioned countries talking about a new beginning in the country and how life will never go back to how it was again. However, in Western countries, and principally the Anglo-Saxon countries of the world, by which I mean, of course, Britain, America, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, we have heard politicians and journalists talking about the new normal. We have seen thousands of jobs, thousands of livelihoods destroyed. So I'm quite concerned, not just by COVID-19, but I'm concerned about how this is being handled. And I would go as far to say exploited by some very dangerous forces in the Western world, because Russia had a lockdown, Iran had a lockdown. But as I said, no one there is talking about...
Whether they're talking about it or not, it's objectively true, isn't it? Iran has been devastated.
Yes.
And as a matter of deliberate policy by the United States, the Trump administration did everything they could to destroy the Iranian people using the COVID-19 crisis. Russia not only was devastated by the pandemic, but was the first in the field with a workable vaccine. Not that we're able to buy it here, of course. They would never allow that. COVID-19 has put thousands of businesses out of business. It will undoubtedly lead to the snapping up of assets at fire sale prices by bigger businesses. The trend to monopoly will accelerate, and millions of people are out of work. In the United States, there are more people out of work now as a percentage than were out of work in 1935 at the height of the Depression. I mean, this is real.
It certainly is, but there are safeguards in place in countries such as Russia and Iran which are preventing thousands of people from losing their jobs. For example, in Russia, there's a Soviet-era piece of legislation which stipulates that in a scenario where there is a natural disaster, so to speak. It is the legal obligation of the Russian government to ensure that not one Russian citizen loses their jobs. So every Russian citizen who has been out of work in 2020 has received a full salary. Now that, in my opinion, speaks plenty about the decent legislation which the Soviet Union had, but you can't say the same about Britain. You
Far
can't say
from
the
it.
same about America.
Far from it. Mass penury, poverty has been the result for the masses in most Western countries. James Giles, you are the smartest political 20-year-old I've ever met since I met myself at 20. One of the youngest candidates in the British general election just a year ago, did very well too. As a 20-year-old, how was 2020 for you?
Absolutely dire. But I think it was dire for all manner of people. Touching on some of Marcus's points, it was certainly a devastating year for many people in the West. The East seemed to have bounced back.
And handle it better.
And handle it far better. You mentioned the, of course, Russian vaccine. Well, here in Britain, we've just approved the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. And you have the Western media, CNN, standing outside a London hospital interviewing this 90-year-old gentleman saying, "You're one of the first in the world to be vaccinated. How do you feel?" Of course, completely missing
quite
the point.
fortuitously, his name
Absolutely.
was William Shakespeare. I'm not making that up. His
Absolutely.
name was William Shakespeare.
But completely missing the point, of course, that in other parts of the world that perhaps aren't quite as friendly with the West, vaccines have been available for quite some time and with some success.
Well, China has 5.
Absolutely.
Like London buses, you wait for one and 5 come along at once.
But the vaccination programme here in the West, we've only got the one. We're still waiting for the other 4 buses to turn up. Not quite as efficient as countries like China. But that one vaccine we've got now, of course, can't be given to those who have adverse medical conditions. If you're at risk of anaphylactic shock, you can't have it. And so it seems that we are lagging behind the East. I think next year the economy will continue to grow and thrive in places like China, whilst the job losses that we've seen in the West, be you a young person like myself, many of my colleagues will be working 0 hours contracts, very little
If they're lucky, yeah.
job security, be out of work, out of a job. Older people having their careers and their professions just torn apart as businesses go under and under and under in the West. That's only just beginning. And so 2020, whilst it has been a terrible year for most, 2021 at the moment in the West doesn't look like it's going to be a huge amount better.
Although, Dr. Tom, it's an ill wind that blows nobody any good, the richest people on the planet got fantastically richer in this year of horribilis. This annus horribilis has been great for people like the owner of the Washington Post that I referred to earlier, who in his spare time runs Amazon. They've done really well. Will these be big structural changes? I suspect that they will. I don't think people are going to stop using Amazon and start going back to the high street to shop in the local department store.
No, I agree. I think they'll be forced to use Amazon because a number of shops, if we have a third lockdown, a number of shops are going to go under. I think in addition to the businesses that have already gone under, far more businesses will fail, which will again push people to go online. On top of that, we have more people working from home, so they're going to be using the internet more frequently. As you mentioned, Jeff Bezos, I think he's accumulated several more billion at least in the more than that probably. I can't remember the figure, but he's accumulated a lot more money during the pandemic. Not only him, but a number of billionaires in the US have actually increased their wealth.
If he gave every employee of Amazon £105,000 as a bonus, he would still be richer at the end of 2020 than he was at the beginning of it. Just think about that. This is a company that employs 500,000 people. Let's go to the United States and talk with Medea Benjamin, a wonderful American political activist who co-founded Code Pink with whom I used to work in the Iraq issue in years gone by. Can Biden reunite the divided states of America?
This country is not going to be united. This is a divided country, deep divisions that Trump only brought them out, but they existed before Trump. We have systemic racism, which the country refuses to really address. We have a climate crisis, which this country refuses to address. This pandemic is only reveals how broken the US health system is. And then there's issues just about priorities. And I think Trump has somehow managed to make himself into a populist who is leading the calls for people who are feeling left out of the economic system. Somehow he has become their champion, which is so odd. And so I think there will be big economic problems this country will have to deal with, and those will exacerbate all of the racial problems, immigration issues. Biden is supposed to bring in more of the immigrant community, but that is going to be used by the right as saying these people are taking our jobs, these people are not American, these people are getting vaccinations, they're using our healthcare system. Another reason why there won't be unity in this country is because the Republicans will be trying to stop Biden from accomplishing anything, whether it's saying no to some of his nominated cabinet positions, to trying to stop relief packages or any significant pieces of legislation that will address the real needs of the people and the climate will be stopped by Republicans in Congress.
Under Biden, will the US reestablish the relationship they once had with China?
I think, unfortunately, Biden will continue to some extent the negative views towards China, but certainly there's a lot of anti-China sentiment in the United States, and Biden is partially responsible for that as well. He used that during his campaign. In fact, there was a lot of competition between Trump and Biden as to who was the hardest on China. And that is very dangerous for those of us who understand that cooperation is the only way forward, whether it's working with China around the pandemic, the climate crisis, or in the United States to get us off of this treadmill of the military taking so much of our tax dollars. When you present China as an enemy, it's a justification for continuing the US military buildup, which really must stop if we're going to have the funds we need to address the real problems, the real threats we face and will be facing in 2021 and beyond.
In your view, will Biden revisit the Iranian nuclear deal?
One of our most positive hopes is that Biden does go back to the Iran nuclear deal, and that this could ease a lot of the tensions in the Middle East and pave the way for the US to finally withdraw from so many of the conflicts it's been unjustly involved in. But let's not be naive about this, and I'm sure you're not, George. You know there's a lot of pressure coming from Israel, coming from the Saudis, coming from strong lobbies in the United States, like the AIPAC lobby. They don't want Biden to go back into the nuclear deal without more conditions. And Iran is just going to not have it. You know, they say you either go back into this deal or there's no deal. So it's not going to be easy. But I do think there's enough people in Biden's new administration that were part of negotiating the deal, understand how important it is. And we hope that with the pressure coming from peace groups like ours, we will see Biden administration re-entering the Iran nuclear deal.
Dr. Marcus, that was one of the landmarks of 2020, wasn't it? That the United States crashed and burned. It was exposed to the whole world as having a health service completely unfit for purpose, an economy utterly skewed to the interests of the richest people, and almost in its DNA, determination, whatever the elected president thought, to continue the endless foreign wars. Let's not forget, Donald Trump did actually try to bring American forces out of various theaters. He was simply unable to do so, either because of his cabinet members or the deep state. Somehow he was frustrated in that.
You know, George, every 4 years in the world, a peculiar phenomenon occurs in which commentators, and I use the word commentators in a very loose way, make the argument that a new incoming American president is going to be almost revolutionary. They're going to bring good to America, they're going to bring good to the world. And it really is preposterous nonsense. It is absurdity at its most absurd. And it demonstrates that these so-called commentators, who by and large are liberals, or we might call them today neoliberals, are totally ignorant about the structures of power in America. Because despite what the US Constitution states, namely that an American president has tremendous powers, in reality, the structures of power in America are not centered on the president. They're centered on families, they're centered on organizations, institutions, companies, and corporations. And we have been hearing this tiresome argument certainly throughout the duration of my life. If I go back to 2008, when I was a reporter on Tribune magazine, I remember people at Tribune saying, if Barack Obama becomes president, the world will become a better place. And I asked them, why would you say that? And they said to me, because he's black. And I said, well, that's implicitly racist towards non-black people. But I also said, it doesn't matter who sits in the White House, because once someone comes into the White House, the machinery, the machines of the American government, they come around them and they dictate to them what the domestic policy is going to be, fundamentally speaking, and what the policy of the foreign policy is going to be, fundamentally speaking, as well. And I also said to people in 2008 that, yes, Barack Obama is part black, but he's also part English. And you want to understand what his English ancestry actually is. So Joe Biden will simply continue American foreign policy. He's very close to the Israelis. He's very close to the Saudis. I find it difficult to believe he will, under him, America will rejoin the JSPOA, and it will simply be business as usual. America will always remain the same old America, no matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat. The Republican and Democratic parties exist solely to maintain the facade that America is a democracy. Both parties, fundamentally speaking, economically and in terms of foreign policy, are identical to one another.
A scorpion stings because it's a scorpion. We'll be right back. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, but reviewing the world in 2020 and the world we face now in 2021. Dr. Tom, let's deal with Iran first. Biden promised, what could go wrong? Biden promised in the election that the US would rejoin the nuclear deal between Iran and other big, powerful blocs and countries in the world, which had been working to everyone else's satisfaction. But he has several problems with that, doesn't he? First of all, rejoining it has to get through the Senate, which may very well still be in Republican hands. It has to face up to the Israel lobby in America, which is determined to stop that re-entry. Then the Iranian resistance to any further changes to that deal before allowing America to rejoin it, and its demand that all sanctions have to be lifted on Iran. How realistic is it that we'll see a new US posture towards Iran?
I think the first thing to point out is that America's been punishing Iran since the 1953 when they overthrew, or they played a role in overthrowing President Mossadegh, to try to nationalize the country's oil. Ever since then, it's been a case of death by 1,000 paper cuts with sanctions. And regardless of who's in charge, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican president, sanctions have been pretty much full on the Iranians. I think, although Biden might talk the talk, he might appear more conciliatory. He might appear to want to rejoin the deal. He's going to be given his marching orders, as Marcus said. There is a machinery around the president. Biden is influenced by AIPAC. There are people in the Democratic Party who want a war with Iran. So
Indeed, that's so. Let's get a view from Moscow. Mark Sleboda is an American living in Russia. He's international relations and security analyst and lecturer, and formerly a senior lecturer at Moscow State University. Will America under Biden ignore Russia and China when it comes to the economy?
Okay, so particularly with China, even with Trump, it is impossible for the United States to ignore China economically. What the Trump administration was trying to do was to decouple as much as possible the United States and its allies, right, across the West and U.S. Client states in the Pacific economically from China. I do not expect that policy to be much reversed in the Biden administration. There has been no word from any of his senior foreign policy advisors or him himself about the reversals of sanctions or tariffs, or there hasn't even been a lot of discussion out of them about returning to some type of trade deal with China. At the same time, there are signals from the Biden administration that it may not be expecting to increase tensions any more than they already are. And in particular, Biden's presumed nomination of Jake Sullivan as the Secretary of State and General Lloyd Austin as Secretary of Defense, instead of possible contenders Susan Rice and Michelle Flournoy for Secretary of Defense, is being read by many countries around the world as a less confrontational stance on China. When it comes to Russia, a lot of people are surprised by this, but the U.S. actually has quite a large $16 billion trade deficit with Russia. That is, the U.S. buys more from Russia than Russia buys from it. But that's still a relatively small amount in terms. U.S. under the Trump administration enacted 46 rounds of sanctions against Moscow, and there is no talk about any of them being lifted, which would be a requirement to improve relations, economically speaking, by the Biden administration, by its principles, and so on, without at least enormous concessions by Russia on Crimea, stop supporting the Syrian government, etc. That Russia is, almost certainly unlikely to make. So I don't expect any economic improvement at all in the Biden administration with Russia.
Do you think we'll see a more hawkish America under Biden? How will the U.S. relate to, for example, Russia and Syria?
Yeah, there are mixed signals out of the Biden administration. And we have to remember that Biden was vice president under Obama for the U.S. military proxy war on Syria. And then, the beginning of the deployment of troops. Likewise, Biden was Obama's point man for the new regime that they helped shepherd into power after it overthrew the democratically elected government in Ukraine in 2014. I would accept the Biden administration will probably increase military arms supplies and support for the government in Ukraine, which will lead to a symmetrical response from Russia to Ukrainian forces in the Donbass that are still opposed to the regime in Kiev. And that there's a potential for military escalation and conflict there. In Syria, there are a lot of discussion by Biden's senior foreign policy advisors about the restoration of the proxy war on Syria, the illegal arming, training, and salarying of tens of thousands of sectarian Islamist and jihadist militants that are currently all supported by Turkey. If that's the case, then that could lead to a resuscitation of more serious potential for direct military conflict between the US and Russia and Syria. Essential, of course, it would be better if the US would just withdraw their illegal occupation forces. But I think that would be very hard for Biden to do, even if he wanted to, because under the Trump administration, it became clear that the US deep state, the unelected bureaucracy in the security services, the Pentagon, the State Department, do not want to see the US withdraw from Syria, even if Biden wanted to, which I've seen no indication of.
Dr. Marcus, that's one of the great mysteries of the age, isn't it? Trump, in the narrative of the liberals in the West, Trump was a Russian agent. He was Putin's buddy. He was deeply compromised. Compromat was held on him, and all of this guff, none of which was ever established. The truth is, isn't it, that the Trump years, as Mark just said, 46 rounds of sanctions against Russia, the withdrawal from the INF treaty, the refusal to prolong other, even more important military agreements, the withdrawal from the open skies, the confrontation in Syria, and so on. Actually, Trump was more anti-Russian in his actions than any of his recent predecessors.
There's no question about it that under Donald Trump, relations between Washington and Moscow were even worse than how they were under Obama. But I don't think that was Donald Trump's responsibility per se. I believe it was what I would like to call the American establishment. I know in this day and age we are now talking about deep state, but for me deep state has Ottoman connotations, and I prefer the more traditional wording of the American establishment or the American elite. And also under Donald Trump, American forces were redeployed from Germany to Poland, which is a flagrant violation of the Russia-NATO Founding Act of 1997. But despite, once again, some people saying there's an opportunity for a foreign relations between Washington and Moscow under Biden, there is no chance of that happening whatsoever. Why? Simply because Russia, as we talk now, is a superpower. Back in the 1990s, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and I use the word dissolution because the Soviet Union was dissolved, it did not collapse, it was dissolved by three traitors, Yeltsin of Russia, Kravchuk of Ukraine, and Shostakovich of Belarus. America was content with Russia in the 1990s. Why? Because Russia had become a third-rate power, with the exception of its nuclear arsenal. Russia was subservient to America. Russia was on an IMF loan. But under Vladimir Putin, Russia has resurrected much of its lost superpower status. And that is very evident because it was Russia which played the cardinal role in defeating the American objective in Syria. It was Russia which played the cardinal role in defeating the American objective in Venezuela. And America is simply not prepared to share power in the world with any other country which can challenge American or Western global hegemony. And I would say this as well, that sooner or later there will be a new country in the world, and I'm talking about the reunification, the natural reunification of Russia with Belarus. Most people know Belarus as Belarus, because following the American and British attempt to instigate a coup in Belarus in the summer of 2020, that has it was an abysmal failure, and it always was going to be, because the Belarusians and the Russians never wanted to be separated. As I said, they were separated by three treacherous Soviet politicians in 1991. But the attempted coup in Belarus in 2020 has actually brought about, or will bring about, the materialization of the union state of Russia and Belarus. Now the Russian military is responsible for the guarding of Belarus's borders with, for example, Poland and Ukraine. Russian special services are now on a daily basis briefing President Alexander Lukashenko, who's the president of Belarus. So Russia's position in Belarus, strong beyond all belief as it was before the attempted coup, is simply absolutely unchallengeable now. So I believe that once Russia and Belarus reunite, then you will see an increase in tension between America and Russia. So watch this space regarding Belarus.
We will, definitely. Let's go to Alex Rubinstein, who's in Mexico City. Alex is an investigative journalist for the Grey Zone, Mint Press, Sputnik, and RT. Alex, what is your understanding of the US direction of travel under Biden?
Well, you know, I think there's a tendency in the mainstream media to act as though Joe Biden has descended from the heavens and will bring on a new era of American empire with a cleaner face. But in the US, that image may be cleaner. Abroad, it's really no different. And in many ways, I think it's worse. If you look at Joe Biden's history and the history of his cabinet picks, we see that it's caused these policies that they've advocated and championed have caused some of the worst crises in modern history. If we're talking about the genocidal Saudi war against Yemen, our new Secretary of State is the one who pushed and advocated and announced in Riyadh itself that the US would be expediting arms shipments to the Saudis. If you look at Libya, many of these cabinet members played a central role in advocating for that war. And what that has caused is a failed state. In fact, we have 3 failed states in Libya that are all warring with each other. And slavery has been brought back to the African continent because of these policies. If you look at Ukraine, Sullivan, Anthony Sullivan, was the one who was the go-between between Joe Biden and Olga Tanyabok, who was a neo-Nazi leader of the Sleboda party in Ukraine. And if you look at Latin America, where I'm based right now, Joe Biden's policies, Joe Biden himself, his policies have been absolutely disastrous. From Brazil, where he was an architect of the Lava Jato, or car wash program, which was the lawfare that ousted Lula da Silva. If you look at Colombia, he also played a major role in Plan Colombia, which militarized the government, hyper-militarized the police and the military in order to cut down on the drug trade, and that was absolutely ineffective. The drug trade went up after that plan. If you look at Central America, it was the same. It was more of the same. It was he was a champion of the Alliance for Prosperity, which just dumped guns and cash into these right-wing authoritarian neoliberal governments. So in many ways, you know, I mean, Trump was a bit of an oaf, really, and he tried to do the coup in Bolivia, and he tried to do a coup in Venezuela, but those failed miserably. Biden, however, was successful in his 2009 coup in Honduras, which has turned the reins of government over to a drug cartel, essentially. Juan Orlando Hernandez is deeply involved in the drug trade, and we know that from court documents from the United States. So, you know, really the only thing is that it's imperialism with a nicer face. And I think that even people in Mexico, where I'm based, will learn that Biden is not really better than Trump. Unfortunately, they weren't given the information by the media that Joe Biden and Barack Obama deported more immigrants than Trump ever did in any of the 4 years that they in either of their two terms. So it's going to be a wake-up call for, I think, a lot of people in this region, that really the Democrats are not to be trusted and are not so much better than the Republicans.
You paint a very pessimistic image. Is your view shared by very many in the United States?
Well, it's certainly a fringe idea, but unfortunately in the United States, due to the corporate media landscape, facts are fringe. I mean, nothing that I've said just now is not well documented. It's all well documented. However, information is scarce in the U.S. and you have media which basically falls upon partisan lines, where the Republicans are saying that Joe Biden is evil incarnate, and the Democrats are saying is that he's basically Jesus Christ. So there's really no room for nuance or understanding of his many years as a civil servant. I mean, we forget that he was whipping up votes for the Iraq War, the deeply unpopular Iraq War. I mean, this war, nobody wants it. Nobody likes it. People want it to end, but Joe Biden was the one who was whipping up Democratic support for it in the Senate.
Dr. Tom, imperialism with a nicer face, as Alex Rubinstein said. That kind of sums up the point of view of the panel here this evening, doesn't it? In places like Latin America are not likely no longer to feel the foul breath of coups and dictatorships and lawfare and so on. The Middle East is not likely to get better. The confrontation with Russia and China not likely to take a different turn. It's not exactly a happy new year to look forward to, is it?
Well, no, not quite. I mean, whenever say Russia or squashes an attempt by the American imperialists to get rid of a leader, they just try again somewhere else. It's like the whack-a-mole game, essentially. For example, I mean, Russia, together with Iran, helped save Syria from the Islamic State. I mean, Russia has now been involved in actually freezing the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh. It's known that the Turks heavily supported the Azerbaijanis in that, and Turks are also involved in Libya. But essentially, I think, as Marcus mentioned earlier, the Russians also helped the Venezuelan leader stay in power, the elected leader of Venezuela, rather than the puppet like Guaido. But I think the imperialists will try again. I mean, they tried with Svetlana Tikhanova in Belarus. That failed. They got rid of Morales temporarily in Bolivia. Now he's back, or on his way back. But they'll keep trying. And I think under Biden, as you say, maybe imperialism with a nice face, but if anything, that's even worse.
Yeah, I mean, nice face, silly old man face. He's not actually going to be running the country.
Oh, no,
even entering the caveat that Dr. Marcus did, that no president ever really runs the country. This is a president who can barely get out of the bath without breaking his ankle, saying that he tried to clutch his dog by the tail. Try and work that one out. This is a president who will really be more or less openly run by other people.
Indeed, I think Kamala Harris is waiting her turn. I mean, Kamala Harris, let's not forget her background. She was a prosecutor. She put lots of African Americans away in prison in her role working with the police. So she hasn't exactly got a great background either.
No, well, more importantly, nobody elected her. Nobody in the Democratic Party wanted her as their nominee. She got 1% of the votes before dropping out of the race. It's deeply troubling, isn't it, that the most powerful person in the world, perhaps next year, is someone for whom nobody ever voted.
Well, exactly. What's more sad is there were actually decent candidates in the Democratic Party. We had Tulsi Gabbard, a woman of color who was very anti-war, a former veteran, so and she's anti-war at the same time. She was pro-healthcare. She was anti-imperialism. We had Bernie Sanders, who had a good record, yet they were pushed away by the Democratic machine.
Yes, twice.
Twice.
James, when I was your age, it was the greatest hope in Britain and in most Western countries that one would acquire a trade, serve an apprenticeship, become an electrician or a woodworker or any of the important trades that we still need. And for others, it was, if you couldn't get a trade, that you'd have a steady job in a stable workplace that would provide holiday pay and sick pay, and for which you might, if you were lucky, work for 30 years and then get a watch and retire on a pension you could live on. I hate to rub it in, but that's not what faces you and people of your age.
No, absolutely not. The future for people my age typically is go to school, do your exams. If you don't do your exams or don't do well in your exams, then that's more or less it for you. You're confined to low job security, low wage forevermore, minimum wage, I would say, in a shop, but after this,
Soon no
not
shops.
even in a shop.
He's on a bike delivering.
Yeah,
isn't it?
maybe on a bicycle delivering food for £2 per meal you deliver, which is a measly wage for anybody. But even if you go to school, you do your exams, you're academically bright, you do your college, university, whatever, what then? In this economy, in this day and age, there aren't jobs. There simply aren't jobs. And so even if you've got a degree, you'll still end up delivering food for £2 a meal because there's nothing else for you here at the moment. And it's a very harrowing and concerning vision for the future that there's just no hope for this to get better.
And you don't think that that Britain leaving the European Union and having levers entirely in its own hands that it can use to make a better Britain, you're not confident about that?
Well, look, if it were in the hands of a competent government, then maybe. But we're led by this privately educated charlatan who doesn't know what he's doing in the afternoon, yet alone first thing in the morning when he wakes up. Left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. The government is U-turning. It's, I would say, being led by the opposition, but of course we now even have an opposition that doesn't know how to oppose in Britain, that is just simply nodding through every shambolic thing the government's doing. And so, had things been different last December, then yeah, maybe a brighter future may have been on the horizon. But where we currently are, no hope.
Dr. Marcus, most people in the world would rather have President Putin running their country than the people who are running their country. And most people in the world would rather have their foreign policy in the hands of Mr. Lavrov than in the hands of the person currently running their foreign policy. Was that widely off the mark?
I believe exactly what you said in this broadcast. I've come across quite a number of Britons who are now expressing a lot of sympathies towards Vladimir Putin, not necessarily his policies, but the way in which he runs his country. Because Vladimir Putin is a very strong leader. Vladimir Putin is devoted to his country, to his land, to his people. Vladimir Putin will protect, by all means necessary, Russian culture, the Russian religion, Orthodox Christianity, and he will protect Russia from all threats, internal and external. The same, alas, cannot be said about Western leaders, in particular British and American leaders, because what we see in America and Britain are leaders who care nothing about their country, they care nothing about their culture, they care nothing about their people. What they care about is their own personal wealth, their own personal ambitions, and their own personal power. We see in Britain today British culture being deliberately eroded, and where are British politicians to stand up and defend British culture? We have a Labour Party which, once again, like the Republican and Democratic parties, is simply the Conservative Party. Indeed, Soviet diplomats used to say in the 40s and the 50s that the Labour Party is not a true working class party. It's not a true socialist party. There may be some individuals who are genuine, but as a whole, it is a party controlled by the British establishment. And I think the Soviets were absolutely correct. But Vladimir Putin has shown that with strong leadership, with real patriotism and absolute devotion to his country, his people and his land, countries can fare far better than what we see happening in Britain and America, because Britain and America, year in, year out, is rapidly deteriorating.
and defending their allies, come what may. You see, it's inconceivable that Britain and America, or their leaders, would have stood by Syria if the boot had been on the other foot. This onslaught that almost, as you put it, annihilated Syria as we know it, a place where religions coexist happily, where minority religions are cherished and protected, a Syria where men and women can mix freely, a Syria that can have an independent foreign policy. That is still standing is a tribute to two things: the steadfastness of the Syrian people and the courage of their army, and the fidelity of their ally, Russia, under Vladimir Putin. That's my take, anyway. I wish I could wish you all a happy new year, but I'd be lying. But try and have one anyway. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen Television. Thank you for watching.